Hey folks, I haven't done a video in a while, about a week and a half or so, because I was on holiday, and so I wanted to catch up on just analysing the news that we get here in the UK, so that so I can share my views with you, but also so that our American friends can have a look at what we're finding out over here. One of the main things, I found a really interesting article in City AM magazine, newspaper, written by their editor Alistair Heath, and I got sort of cover the points pretty much as he wrote them. I did a little bit of extra research around some of the areas that he did, that he mentioned, and it's very telling. You know, his headline was that it was decision time for profligate America, and you know, in his view, he thinks that there's a real risk that America could already be in terminal decline financially because of the situation that they're in, suggesting that there's really only three situations that can come out of the current status, which is either that America will end up in long-term bankruptcy because they simply won't get their financial situation together, or that indeed that the Democrats, Republicans, etc. Simply won't be able to negotiate effectively together to sort out the situation. If that continues, then that bankruptcy is inevitable, and I think the way that the deficit, etc., is going, it can't go on forever. It's got to end up in that situation. Another alternative is the adoption of a European-style socialist economy, where the benefits are continually increased, so the things like social security, Medicaid, etc., are continually increased, and people become more and more dependent on it. And there's been comment again from from the community that maybe that's the plan. They're trying to essentially strip mine primarily the middle class, I guess, of their assets that they've built up over the last 20 or 30 years, and get them dependent on the government. There's been, and in the UK, there's been about 20 or 30 years of people going to university, getting good educations, getting blue collar, white collar type roles, work, and building up a reasonable bit of wealth in their homes, etc. But as we've seen in the UK, and as we've seen in America, that just blew apart in the last couple of years. And again, this idea of a socialist America, very much like socialist Europe, because Europe is predominantly a socialist environment politically, socially. That could end up in America, a very real possibility. Again, if something isn't done to preserve, the sort of status, the idea of having the constitutional republic. I guess the third option then is that actually, American politicians see sense, and all of the big government stuff, that Ron Paul sort of talks against, is disassembled, unravelled, and the trillions, in fact, I was going to say billions, it's trillions and trillions of dollars a year that's put into all of the sort of social welfare stuff, or the military, which is a massive part of the budget, gets unwound, but in very real terms, because again, politicians in America and Britain have this habit of saying, they're cutting budgets on this, that, and the other, and they're often budgets that don't get spent. They've been allocated, but they don't get spent, or they get spent in times of need, and so they just, they in principle cut the budget, but there's no actual money saved. And again, I've seen somewhere else in an article today this idea that, I kind of make these figures up, but just for scale, there's a proposed sort of $8 billion saving, but actually it'll be like 350 million, and it's just incredible. Standard & Poor obviously put a negative rating on the AAA credit status of America last week, I think it was, and that says that while America still maintains its AAA credit rating, there's the risk that it will go down, and a lot of people are not happy about that. But the financial situation in America is just incredible. There's a guy called Michael Tanner of the Cato Institute who wrote a paper that I believe prompted Standard & Poor's to give this negative rating. His paper is called Bankrupt: Entitlements in the Federal Budget. I think in the US you might call it entitlements. We call it, the sort of social welfare type benefits. And he says in there that over the past 40 years, federal spending, excluding states and local government, has averaged about 21% of GDP. So that gross domestic product, everything that gets, either gets made or sold, depends on which way. I think you can cut GDP in two ways, but it's essentially everything that gets produced by the country. So he's saying 21% of GDP, federal spending equates to 21% of GDP on average over the last 40 years, while revenue has been roughly 16.6%. So it's only a very minor structural deficit there, but it still is a deficit, and over the last 40 years, a deficit of even a few percent makes a difference. Given the state of the economy, of course, that deficit becomes more significant, whereas you might expect an economy to continually expand, as it has done, sort of in the last 20 or 30 years on average, but recently not so. The difference between revenues and deficit kind of maintain themselves, so it's okay. Of course, that's not been happening now because the economy's pretty much collapsed. He went on to say that the highest ever tax rate was 20.6% in 2001. So 20.6% of GDP in 2001 was the highest they got in, whereas the overall federal spending was 21% of GDP. So in the last 40 years, obviously the deficit, the difference has contracted and expanded, but there's been this 3 to 4 point difference continually. However, given the contraction of the economy in the US, the tax that gets taken in now is, he's saying, 14.9%, so call it 15%, when average federal spending is 21%, so you're talking about 6%. 6% might not feel much, but when you're only talking about 20%, that's almost a third. It's just under a third, isn't it? 6, 12, 18 on 21% of of this 21% of GDP spent on federal spending. So there's only a tax income of 14, call it 15% now. But spending has also soared in the other direction. So the gap between what the government's earning and what it's spending has increased, obviously. Not only has the income reduced, but the spending's increased. It's just incredible. And then, of course, we've got another war going on. And I say we because the British and American economies are so tied. We tend to sort of mirror what happens in the US, obviously on a much smaller scale, but we pretty much behave in the same way generally. So, what you see in the US is happening in the UK. If this was some kind of cyclical issue, like economic bubbles bursting, like we had the dot-com bubble burst, and then the property bubble burst. If it was cyclical in that way and wasn't a response to pretty much a systemic problem in the way that the global banking cartels operate, then you might be able to recover from it. The problem is the issue is systemic, and as far as I think the community is concerned, the issue is one that is purposefully generated. So we have a continuing problem. In fact, he goes on further in the paper to say that he calculates that by 2050 federal government spending will exceed 42% of GDP, and if you add in all of the states and local government spending that he excluded on those earlier figures, it would be nearer 60%. So the government consuming nearly 60% of everything that America produces. This is what was it? Is it 14? Let me just have a look at this World Bank reference here. Well, it's 2009, but in 2009, gross domestic product of US, according to the World Bank, was 14.1 trillion. So what's that? 8 trillion? And it's just incredible. What government